Good day, folks. Thanks for coming to Finding One for Our Son here at Madison 365. I'm Matthew Brogna, your host. You can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and all that fun jazz. Please hit subscribe, like, and everything. A little late, I guess. I don't know, depending on the airing. But happy Black History Month, folks. So I'm going to start this one off a little bit different, and really kind of first talking about myself, or really my family, and the complexities of it, and a bit about white passing and other things. So myself, I'm what historically in the context of the United States, you would be able to describe as white passing. Black, which means that I can pass as white if I so choose. But in a weird way, it's not up to me. What this really means, and the only way that you can really pass as white in this country, particularly if you're coming from a mixed race family, is to fully embrace white supremacy. So I would have to effectually reject my entire family. And some folks might not quite grasp that. So it means that, yeah, the only way I could pass for white, as soon as I don't embrace white supremacy and whiteness and all that encompasses it, I am no longer white. It means that I have one of the original sins, the stains, in my blood. This is where the idea of this one drop rule came, where if you had one drop, you were considered black. Interestingly enough, this was a inspiration for some of Hitler's Nuremberg laws and some of the other Jim Crow stuff were inspiration and other aspects of this. But it's really kind of hard to describe exactly what that means, because I should say like what having to embrace white supremacy, but it is. I would have to be lean conservative, deny the type of race and racism that exists in this country, and so on and so forth. How it works is basically white people looking to me to reaffirm their racist views, or I have to fully embrace those to become white. So if they know I'm mixed, it becomes well, you're one of the good ones, and let's, and it's a pushing of reaffirming racist views, and it happens. It happens to me, of white folks that don't know me, that learn I'm mixed, that try and use my proximity to blackness as a way to my proximity to blackness and whiteness. It's an interesting kind of way to navigate to affirm their racist beliefs about black people, to have me agree with what they're saying or believe, to tell them that it's true. And yeah, but let's say I'm even as passing, and I'm engaged and somebody thinks I'm white, a white person thinks I'm white, and they start spotting something racist. And I might start pushing back against that. What makes me no longer white in that situation is my own proximity to blackness. Is that as soon as I start engaging in the conversation, it changes. And it changes for me, because I'm not just talking about something abstract. I'm talking about my family in real ways, and how race and racism impacts my family and impacts me. Because if I'm out and about with my parents, depending on where we're at, our safety could be in danger. And so then as soon as that comes out, I'm no longer white. As soon as it comes out, I'm mixed, I'm no longer white. As soon as it comes from, having to talk about things my own family has gone through, I'm no longer white. Such as that at least one known relative, or one relative we know, was lynched. And maybe more. Most black families do have those stories. Ours is a recorded one. I believe it's my great-great-grandfather watched his father lynched. And an interesting aspect to this, and perhaps more, is there was a reading of the New York Times when the memorial to lynching victims, I believe it was in Alabama, was being constructed. They did a whole write-up about different people that were written in there. And there's this one about a family called the Higginbothams. If you don't know, I'm from the Higginbotham line of trees. There's Paul Higginbotham, my dad's twin brother, and my dad, Steve Browngen. And my parents changed their last names when they got married. My mom's original last name, they kind of rejiggered the spelling of it. And they took the Gin from Higginbotham, brought it together, and you have Browngen. So I'm a Higginbotham in the traditional sense. And it's an English last name. Obviously, I'm on that side of the family, we're not English. And so is Higginbotham. There's an English line all the way to Higginbotham. So, Higginbothams, they're not related. They're in that sense. But in this sense, in this New York Times story is interesting. So the Higginbothams were talking, and they said their matriarch fled after the patriarch of the family was lynched and changed their last name to Higginbothams from Higginbotham. We're able to trace our last name to a plantation in Virginia, I believe. So, that very well could be related, at least in some sense, right? So at least one known and maybe two that we know of. And that goes beyond experiences that my own father had growing up at the kind of the end of the Jim Crow era. And in marrying a white woman. How that, that dynamic, they were pretty early on in not having their marriage illegal in some states, right? Because of Supreme Court ruling that overturned laws where in states where mixed race marriages were illegal. So if they could travel to some states and it was illegal, and even them traveling for much of their lives was still very dangerous across this country. It still is in parts. We drove to Ohio like a year and a half ago before the pandemic to visit my sister and her husband and my niece for Thanksgiving. And, we stopped to pick up gas in some rural town in Indiana, I think. And you had to be on the lookout, right? My mom was the one that pumped the gas. My dad took off a hat he had on of I guess diaspora colors. These are things that you have to navigate, and every Black family has to navigate in different ways, depending on shade and all of that. And my family history is really interesting, particularly on my dad's side. We were able to trace the maternal side all the way back to the Little Johns, all the way back to the 1600s, because the common ancestor we had didn't come through the transatlantic slave trade. We were able to trace her back, I believe it was Ethiopia, from Ethiopia to England to end up into Virginia. And the second owner after the first owner was the last name Little John. And when it comes to slave owners, apparently it was one of the better, whatever that means. He had a church and the folks learned. She had a son, I'm blanking on her name, that was pretty light-skinned and seemed light-skinned enough to pass, as he ended up escaping and becoming a free man eventually. Afterwards, he could read and he became a preacher in a town, and they loved him and protected him after he was found out who he was, and became a free man. This is in the 1600s. They've been free. The Little Johns, that side of the family's been free for quite some time, but there's always been this mixing and this potential of passing and light skinness and how that plays in. And it's, again, it's real and it's different. Sometimes the historical aspect of it was sometimes is for protection. Sometimes it's rejection of Blackness. Much of it did have roots in white supremacy and still does. with the Higginbothams having its own deep history in civil rights activism. With my grandfather being an A&E pastor, and his cousin Leon Higginbotham being the first Black federal appellate court judge, who is also backup for Thurgood Marshall. He worked with Thurgood Marshall on some things. He helped write the South African Constitution, got the National Medal of Freedom when it still meant something from Bill Clinton. He's a bit of a giant when it comes to civil rights, particularly in the legal world. Was. And my own father, being here in Madison, was on the county board, CEO of the Urban League for a number of years. He helped secure the kind of the groundbreaking and initial funding to get the building built where it's at. And really, it was in some rough shape when he took it over. It really was at that point. It was on the Dane County Urban League of Greater Madison was nearing bankruptcy, and he pulled it all up on himself, and helped bring it to where it is today, and in big ways did the real dirty work. And a little personal side note: I don't think he gets enough recognition in this community for a lot of the work that he's done at all. Particularly some of the other names. He's a forgotten name in a lot of the hard, dirty work in the city. That doesn't get a lot of things. But he was also a thorn in people's sides, like myself. So yeah, I can see how some folks kind of feel a certain way about him, but hey, that ain't no thing. But here's the thing, though: a lot of Black folks have been, we've been here longer than most white folks, than the white side of my family, than my mother's family. All right, they came here, immigrated here, kind of a couple different parts, late 18th century, early 19th century, and so on and so forth. Like a lot of white folks. But at that point, a lot of white folks weren't white. Now, there was no such thing as Irish slavery. That didn't happen. There were no Irish slaves in the United States. There were indentured servants. There were sharecroppers, but there were no Irish slaves. And also, chattel slavery was very different, than historical slavery. It's a very unique type of slavery. Before really chattel slavery, particularly in Europe, you could work your way out of slavery. It was much more akin to what we now know as being an indentured servant, where it might end up being where you're working off a prison sentence, or you're working off a debt, or you got captured in war, and eventually you work a number of years and you're set free. Very rarely were you enslaved for your entirety of your life, and very rarely were your children enslaved, or very rarely were you separated. There was human trafficking, but it wasn't industrialized, and it wasn't of entire peoples just based upon the color of their skin. Most of it was due to war or to debt. And colonialism wasn't war, at least as we know it. And chattel slavery was the industrialization of human bondage in a real way. And these were assembly lines of human bondages, using humans as machines, as property, where you had no rights. All your property were your master's property. Your children, your husband or wife could be taken from you at any moment, sold, and you'd never see them again. Ever. If you had children, they were in bondage. And it didn't matter who the father was either, or mother. As white women slave masters also raped Black male slaves and had kids. Many slave masters' kids were also enslaved and considered slaves, their own children. Thomas Jefferson. This is also where whiteness comes from, though. And the interesting aspect of whiteness is that it expands and changes as it sees fit. as Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants weren't seen as white at that point. They're considered non-whites. That is absolutely true. They weren't considered black, but they're considered non-white and not true Americans at one point. But by embracing white supremacy, because Irish people didn't become white until after the Civil War, where they felt that they were, they died for this country, but they also fully embraced white supremacy. And some of this was some manipulation as well. There are very real ways. In New York, for instance, the Civil War helped, in a way, fuel anti-black sentiments within Irish immigrant populations, as well as giving Irish immigrant populations authority over black populations. Police. This is why there's a deep history of being part of law enforcement for those of Irish descent. Oftentimes, Irish and black neighborhoods are pretty close to each other, or at times even integrated. But Irish people were recruited to become police and police black communities, keep them in their place, given power, such as some of the first slave codes written legally were the Virginia slave codes was some of the first, codifications of whiteness and blackness and legality. And it gave property rights and gun rights and oversight rights of white people over black people. These things happen and repeat themselves over and over again. So whiteness expanded. But whiteness also was created. Baldwin talks about this on White People and Other Lies. There are no real white people. There are British, German, Irish, French, and you get facsimiles of some of these cultures now in the United States, because the sacrifice of whiteness is also the rejection of your own individual ethnic identity, or at least the melting pot, the watering down of your own ethnic heritage. You melt it down and becomes the same, this monoculture aspect of it. So a lot of y'all have lost your history to become white. So who are you? What is white culture without oppression? What are white people without oppression? What is whiteness without oppression? Are you white if you're not oppressing? If you're not embracing the lie of white supremacy, the big lie that the United States was founded under, or kind of a series of big lies that becomes the big lie, the idea that the United States is a beacon of freedom and hope, but it's a beacon of freedom and hope for white men. And white people at that point were considered, the myth of the Anglo-Saxon, the English and German heritage of sorts. And even the German stuff gets weird. It's really interesting. I mean, if you want to learn a bit more about it, there's a great book called The History of White People, and I'm blanking out on the author right now. I could go grab it, but I'm not going to. Just The History of White People. You can find it. Just Google it. And it's a bit academic, but it's very interesting. And it talks about this expansion of whiteness. And there's other books on this as well of, how the Irish became white, I believe is the title of one. But how you become white in this country is by embracing white supremacy. That's why you see white Latinx, white Latino folks that are conservative, that embrace anti-blackness, that embrace white supremacy. Ted Cruz, for example. Marco Rubio. You see it's particularly prominent among white Cubans, but you see it elsewhere of the want to become white and the proximity to whiteness. It gives you access, it gives you power, and the rejection, and particularly anti-blackness, is an important aspect of it, but particularly the embracing of white supremacy, which is a lie. So why do you need it? Why do you need people on their knees to feel good about yourself? And what happens when you don't stand over them and when people aren't on their knees? White people need to actually get over themselves and investigate themselves and investigate what whiteness is, particularly in the context outside of white supremacy. So if that's the thing is anti-racism work really isn't, it impacts Black people, but it isn't a Black person problem. Racism isn't a Black person problem. It impacts Black people. It's a white person problem. So why do you need this? Baldwin asked, why do you need an N-word? Why do you need it? You created the N-word. The people that are called the N-word. You created Black people. And out of that, Black people are very real. Out of the attempt to erase our history and our cultures, we created something, we held on to those things, those roots, and grew new branches, and created a people out of oppression. But white people don't exist, because the only thing that binds all together, truly together, is oppression. The only thing that binds white culture together is oppression. Because when you start breaking it down, it's not like white culture. Again, it's Irish, it's Polish. All the original things in this country didn't come from white people. A lot of things that you think might have didn't. A lot of it came from Black folks, Latinos, indigenous nations. Shooting our Constitution was stolen. I think it was the Iroquois Confederacy. I'm again blanking out, but again, you can search this up. And I should have written this down, but it's a little bit more freewheeling. So for me to become white, I have to embrace white supremacy. So what do we do? This is a white people problem. Every time that this country has a chance to choose the right path, to embrace justice, to embrace a multicultural democracy, white people chose the other way. From the revolution, there's a chance to end slavery, but they didn't. The Civil War was fought because of the threat of ending slavery. And once it was ended, Reconstruction was overthrown and Black people were sold out by white folks in the name of white unity. And terror reigned across the South and caused millions of people to flee, refugees in their own country, in their own nation, from violence, brutal violence. Thousands of people were killed that we don't even know were killed, that just disappeared. And thousands more we know were killed. Many more beaten and brutalized that are still alive. There are people that have been beaten, brutalized, and burned by white folks that are still alive today, that suffered through the terror of Jim Crow, that are still alive today. This is not ancient history. It is still alive. The Civil Rights Movement, again, the betrayal of the United States. At the same time, MLK was the most hated man in the United States at the point of his death. All y'all loving people, you probably would not have liked MLK. J. Edgar Hoover viewed him as the most dangerous man in America up until, his assassination. And then you had Fred Hampton, who was assassinated by the US government. You had COINTELPRO, whose entire purpose was to infiltrate Black organizations, to sow discord, to break them up, to arrest them, and had an entire generation of Black activists that were sitting in jail for years on drummed up charges, planting drugs and weapons, or pushing them down a criminal path. And a lot of other folks were killed too, again, like Fred Hampton. Watch Judas and the Black Messiah is coming out on Friday the 12th. Watch that. And you had the drug war and more that were launched. Almost as soon as the Voting Rights Act was enshrined, the carceral state started expanding. And where did the racists go? I mean, the people that were fighting integration almost all white folks were fighting integration. Did they suddenly just not become racist because the civil rights laws were passed? At that same time, you had, at this expansion of democracy, the real fight that culminated in Trump and Reagan in real ways was the overthrow of the New Deal, where rights were being expanded to black people. Deindustrialization targeted black folks first. You had hollowed out cities, Detroit and black neighborhoods, and Milwaukee, and places historically black were hit first before white folks. Side note, you didn't see black folks, try to overthrow the U.S. government because of economic anxiety. At the same time, read some fandom, about really kind of the trauma of the oppressor. And I think I'll kind of take that up on another cast. I kind of rambled on enough today, particularly, on two subjects I definitely want to dive in deeper, and that is the trauma of the oppressor and the betrayal of the U.S. government after the civil rights movement. So I challenge any white folks listening to this to try and identify what it means to be white. What does whiteness mean? And what is it outside of oppression? So you say you're proud to be white. What are you proud about? What are you proud about that isn't specific to an ethnic heritage? What binds these European ethnic heritages together that isn't oppression? Or, because you can pick, go ahead and try and pick something. And then right alongside it, you'll find the oppression of black folks and other people as well. Medical advances. Guess who was experimented on to help do these certain medical advances? The entire aspects of gynecology were done and created on black women and slaves brutally. What scientific advancements were done and experimented on black people? Or stolen through labor that we don't know. So much that Western civilization has been built upon blood and oppression. And that is a unifying factor. So explore it. If you find some, it's not going to disprove the theory, because it might be like one or two things, right? Because the trend is that almost everything that binds white folks together, that binds these European ethnic heritages together, is oppression. You have to do the work, folks. You have to deconstruct and take apart whiteness and white people. White people can no longer exist. People that used to think they were white can continue to exist, but whiteness and white people can no longer exist. People of Irish descent can continue to exist. German descent, French, all that can continue to exist. But you have to deconstruct whiteness. And so I reject it. And so I am a white passing mixed race black male. It's who I am. Anyways, happy Black History Month, folks. Watch Judas and the Black Messiah next Friday. It's supposed to be really good. I'm really excited to see it. And dig deep on Fred Hampton. There's a lot of good stuff about him. But thanks for coming. My name is Matthew Brown. I'm here to find the Warmth for Our Sun at Madison365. Find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Hit subscribe, like, all that jazz, share, do all fun things, and rank or, hit the 5 stars. All that fun stuff. Anyways, stay warm, mask up, stay safe, folks. Thanks for coming, and have yourselves a good week.
This is 365 Media.